There we go. At least there we go, I think. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. That should do it. Today we are, as always, playing Street Fighter V on this Monday.
Good evening, everyone.
Our lounge is going to fill up quite a bit more quickly than usual today, as most of the team is available to play. And there will be both myself and Just Fine on mic, assuming that everything's set up fine voice-wise. I'm going to miss Bison costumes. Not that I plan on stopping playing this game all that quickly once 6 comes out, but I'm still going to miss the Bison costumes because I don't see that many Bison players anymore.
Yeah, they did pretty good for this game, for his costumes, for sure.
Today we are talking about fundamentals as a general thing, and if you are a beginner at these types of games trying to get into them now, just happen to be on our Street Fighter content because, might as well learn from Street Fighter. Understanding what fundamentals are in the case of this game is actually really long and complicated, to the point where I don't always know what people mean when they say it. But it does have a lot to do with movement, and a lot of additional stuff to do with whether or not it's a good idea to do a specific thing, not necessarily because your opponent has a specific outlook on the game, but because it's just a good idea to do it as a generality. In fact, it's because of the fact that you can learn really good fundamentals and then your opponent, particularly better opponents, just break the concept of whether or not it was good to do them in the first place, that it can be hard to understand what exactly it means. At the core, fundamentals is usually about spacing, but not every game actually plays out the spacing game in that way. So you have to look further and try to figure out what exactly is the purpose of spacing yourself correctly. Generally, you could consider it to be just making sure that your opponent can't do certain things to you, and that's probably the easiest explanation. Fundamentals are not being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever that means for the game you're playing. For beginners, this usually means don't just jump all the time to get to your opponent. Understand that you have other paths to get to their position, other things that are good ideas versus bad ideas, things that will probably get you in trouble more than other things, and stuff like that. For example, I shouldn't have done that because I tend to drop that combo often enough that it didn't make sense to have it as a main concept. And your fundamentals therefore can change as you practice different things more and get better at other parts. It does generally tend to take a specific stack per game though. Unfortunately, you can't say the fundamentals of X game are always the same, but the stack itself tends to be about the same for a 2D game, or rather for most 2D games, and it's about the same for most 3D games. The question is which parts of the stack actually apply versus not. Street Fighter is the OG of these games for the most part, and therefore it has what we would call the entire stack. Put your opponent where they need to go in order for you to have advantage. Pressure them when they don't have an option for stopping your pressure easily, or only risky options for stopping your pressure. Limit your jumps to making situations so that your opponent has to focus on too many things at once. And watch for the spacing between the two of you to decide whether or not you could punish a thing they're going to do if you were ready enough. And you can decide what ready enough means. That's why we say that games can easily change whether or not a specific thing is a good idea to do. But your fundamentals are the thing that stop you from dying the same way over and over, the thing that stop you from just getting more or less destroyed, not by your opponent pressuring and you not blocking, though you could consider blocking correctly or blocking for long enough instead of trying to get out of a situation as fundamentals. The problem is that's normally more so a question of how good your execution is and understanding of gaps is than clearly fundamentals. If you're the sort of person who always tries to mash out of pressure and your opponent keeps on using pressure that you can't mash out of, then sure, you failed on a fundamental level, but not necessarily true for the general thing. You can't say because you did this you have failed in every case. It's up to your opponent to break the expectations, to break the flows that you might expect in a match to get their benefit out of it. That, for example, is a good use of the meter because even if I had been blocking, it would give my opponent advantage. And if I don't block, nearly none of my attacks would have won against that move. So it was a good idea to do, even though anything else was probably not so great an idea. From the perspective of fundamentals, you might not want to hit anything there. But if you have the meter and decide, I need this advantage for some reason, I need to get into this position and win from here, then you've gone beyond what most people will consider fundamentals and put your opponent in a situation that they didn't expect to be in. But there is a stack, and that stack is a really good way to look at Street Fighter in particular because it tends to be really easy to see. In Street Fighter we have specifically built our bots, and while the bots can definitely be used in any way, at any time, and in any order, we do have some specific order that we recommend, which is basically the order they're listed on the site. And of course, because building up skills tends to be, in a player versus player game, a bit of a back and forth ladder of who is countering whose current backbone, let's say, the thing that most people are using. Then we similarly build the bots around at least partially this. We of course skip the whole teaching people how to jump properly until later because it's a good chance that if you've gotten into this game, unless you're coming from a 3D game, you're going to jump at least some of the time as a way of getting your offense started because walking is slow and doesn't dodge normals. The entire reason most people like to jump in these games is simply that when you're high in the air above your opponent's head, most of their standard buttons don't hit. So it's a good idea. It's, strictly speaking, a good idea to jump in a 2D game. The question is it a good idea to jump at that opponent at that moment? And that's obviously something you have to work out based on what their options for knocking you out of the air are, and how difficult or misleading you can make the jump itself so that you don't actually get hit properly or don't take a lot of damage when they do anti-air or attempt to anti-air. But it is still the first thing we teach from the other side. The first thing our bots are intended to teach you is how to anti-air and how to understand the differences between two specific types of anti-air that you're likely to need. Without this, it's difficult to even get out of Rookie and Bronze in this game. I'm pretty sure that if you just kept standing there while your opponent jumped at you and weren't good at blocking the jumps either, you would probably just always die. And even if you are good at blocking the jumps, if you are only good at blocking the jumps and your opponent is never particularly afraid that you will actually counterattack them, then because a jumping attack has advantage in this game, they've got no reason to just not jump whenever they possibly can. Meaning that you tend to get locked behind this. People who understand certain fundamentals tend to get higher ranks faster, and people who don't get jumped at. Our Nakali bot and our Ken bot are based on these ideas. Nakali being mostly about defensive spacings and, again, anti-airs, making sure you don't get jumped on and that you can defend a different type of move. In Nakali's case, he can just cross the entire screen very quickly, but the move is very special in that it's not always vulnerable in the first place. Or you have to change which of your attacks you use. You have to get used to the idea that you must counter your opponent's attack based on how far they were when they launched it, even if you block it. You must also get used to the idea that not every single button or special attack you could hit will actually work in that situation. Your opponent will block some of them because they're not fast enough and be punished and hit only by others. This game isn't up to speed with the latest in displays for fighting games, and therefore it doesn't outright tell you that you have achieved a punish as opposed to your opponent didn't block properly. But our Nakali bot is built to block fairly well in those scenarios, and you can learn over time whether or not you did the right thing. And those are two fairly fundamental parts of understanding of fighting games as a whole. Can these moves I'm using actually stop my opponent from continuing to try to hit me? Can I hurt them for trying to hit me?
Round one. Fight.
Did they change his quote versus current? I feel like they changed his quote versus current, because he wouldn't have a reason. Anyway. Maybe he got a whole different set of quotes based on like this costume alone. But this is the normal one, isn't it? Anyway, sorry. Once you've gotten the idea of, oh, my opponent is going to jump and I need to either get out of the way or knock them out of the air. The next thing you obviously would have to learn is the other side. When the opponent is good enough at doing this, specifically, to make sure that your anti-airs are a bad idea, or miss, or at least get confusing, you have to learn to not only recognize this, but also deal with other things that they could do that are based on them getting close and you making a mistake, you going for the anti-air and failing. Similarly, from the other side, if you can get an opponent to use the standard, as it is known, DP, the invincible, usually, wake up option, This in this game also doubles as the anti-air for many of the iconic characters that have them in the first place. Learning to land a big punish because of this style of thing is very important. In certain other games, you don't get as heavy a reward for punishing these moves, but in most cases they are extremely disadvantaged. Nearly any move you start your combo or counterattack with will hit. You sometimes even have time to walk into range to hit them, and this is quite important if you are hitting from max range and then not getting your combo, or you have a very powerful move that for whatever reason only hits from very close. Punishes are functionally fundamentals, but a lot of people understand those enough that you don't really have to train them all that hard on it. They will try to get those things because they learn to play fighting games from the perspective of, I have combos, if I learn those combos and those combos do a lot of damage, then I will win. But in this game in particular, there are somewhat specialized combos for punishing those style of move. And therefore our Kenbot mostly covers this space. It's also another understanding of how to anti-air, how to get out of the wrong situations, how to make sure that you don't get hit just by your opponent walking up to you because you're spending all your time focusing on the anti-air. And then it also adds on top of that a fairly iconic move by this point that Ken just does an aerial attack from basically full screen that tends to hit you even if you attempt to anti-air it. You often need to find a whole different anti-air button or special attack. So getting used to that can also help you. Can you consider this a fundamental though? It's hard to say. Because there are many games where that's really not the case, where as long as you do the correct thing, nearly any attack from the air will lose to it. And for quite a few characters in this game even, that's also still true. If you see Ken do this move from far away, and you actually do the correct move that you do to anti-air everything else, then you will probably win. But not everyone has that option, and they do have to learn something. So the Kenbot, while both offering a good option for learning other things, it still helps you keep in mind, oh yeah, I can't just do whatever I want here. Certain characters have to pay more attention to what's happening. But once you've learned to not just jump all the time, now you're stuck, or at least some people get stuck. If I can't jump, and my opponents keep on throwing projectiles and using long punches and kicks and using specials that hit me in weird spaces, and I can't reach my opponent, what's next? How can I do anything? Some people just give up on this kind of, and they can do pretty well in this case, getting up to, at least in this game, the silver rank by, let's say, backing off or standing very still and waiting for the opponent to make a mistake instead. And just making sure they have their combos ready for punishing those mistakes. If you spend enough time learning to punish mistakes, then you can be very, very strong in a lot of games, simply because until your opponent pool is full of a bunch of people who are much better at the game in the sense that they don't make a lot of mistakes, whether or not you win a round is almost entirely about, did my opponent make enough mistakes for me to kill them? And this is a self-selecting pressure in a game with a ranked match system. Everyone who doesn't make those mistakes goes higher, and everyone who keeps making those mistakes stays at the same level. But it's very difficult if you're the one that always plays defensively and waits for others to make a mistake to rise too much yourself. The reason for this seems to be that just numbers. If the players who are not making the mistakes go up higher and they get stopped by something, you can't really get past them anyway. You'll still end up facing those players. If you went from Ultra Bronze to Ultra Silver by punishing your opponents only, but everyone who beat you before is still hanging around in Ultra Silver, still not making mistakes, you've got to come up with something better than, well, I'll wait for you to mess up to get past there. In most cases, you just have to learn to close in, to dash up and throw people who are defending a lot, and similar. Which usually means you've moved on to our Edbot. Edbot also still jumps at you, and you are still supposed to deal with the fact that Edbot jumps at you. But you are a lot more capable of dealing with other things in the matchup, both Ed doing moves that are meant to block you off from approaching, and in some cases Ed approaching you when you have decided to defend, particularly with moves that aren't necessarily punishable. If you just stand there and let Ed do certain things, he will never actually be unsafe enough that you get to hurt him for it. He might randomly get hurt, but for the actual thing he's doing, again, it's random. You can't be sure that our Edbot is going to not just beat you up entirely in a round, so you must learn, after a while of fighting against it, I need to actually do something here. I need to get to him, and I need to see opportunities to get to him. And this is generally the way that one tends to learn movement if you're using the Street Fighter bots. Because Necalli bot does not require you to actually move. A few characters benefit from moving, but you don't have to do it. You could get away with just training, standing there and blocking the entire time, and never think about moving. Ken is at least somewhat similar. You do have to at least respect his offense, but especially if he's using his general attack style and you're taking the easy version of the points where you just punish him as maximally as you can when he does an uppercut, you're not really incentivized to do anything other than stand there and block. Or technically crouch there and block, and the main reason you wouldn't want to just do that forever is, again, having to anti-air. But Ed is still easy, but not quite that easy. Ed is the first point where we're telling you, no, you have to actually get up to Ed and do something. You can't just stand here. By the structure of how bots work, the way they're supposed to teach you, as long as you're doing what bots require of you, doing one of 4 actions or reactions and counting points, it's very, very difficult. Especially if your Edbot is, let's say, input well, it's very difficult to actually get all 10 points before you run out of health, simply because Ed will randomly defeat you, and he won't care about a lot of your options. But you do not end up needing to learn to apply your combos to get into better spacings. The only requirement of the Edbot is, please dash at this person, or walk up to them very quickly, and press your throw button. Some of us don't have a throw button, we press 2 buttons to throw, but at the end of the day, you're still doing something relatively simplistic. You haven't got to learn anything other than the movement rate of whatever character you happen to be playing that day. No combos are required, no meter is required, no understanding of any other aspect. Which means it's universal, and that's why we consider it a fundamental thing. There is no, well, let's do this differently because my character doesn't have this strength, let's use this instead. It's the same for everyone. Some characters are lucky in that they can use the command throw, which would mean that it could not be teched, but the way Ed is meant to train you is to see opportunities for counterattacks where your opponent really probably couldn't tech, or where they were so close to being unable to defend that it's a better idea from their perspective to do so. By that I mean, if we go back to the Necalli situation, and some of what you're seeing in this match, if your opponent hits a strike that you know could be punished, theoretically, but it's really tight, it's really like, you have, as if you're not familiar with frame data, you have some amount of time that it takes for this move to work. In M. Bison's case, for example, you can see that he has a crouching punch and a standing kick, and also a crouching kick, but We're talking the relatively long ones. These moves are very slightly different in how long they take to actually start to hit an opponent. The startup frames are different by 1. And there are certain moves in this game where the punch will work and the kick will not. Simply because of that. If your opponent did a move, you blocked that move, and then they also tried to block afterward,
Round 1.
the punch will hit them, the kick will be blocked. And it's therefore incredibly important to learn this. But the reason this comes up in what I was just saying is, if your opponent has not generally seen you manage to do this, if they've noticed that you either hit the kick when you shouldn't, or because your timing is very slightly off, they keep on managing to block the punch, then their perception is usually going to be, after this situation, I should block. Especially if they see you keep hitting the punch, but they keep on successfully blocking it. Because all that tells them is, your timing is bad. Your timing isn't up to par here. I can keep on getting away with this. And many people will immediately try to do that more. The throw, however, helps you solve this problem. If you were in range, instead of trying the punch, you could take maybe a step forward, maybe not even requires a step forward, and throw them. And you throw them and probably succeed because they're not expecting to be thrown. They're expecting you to hit the punch. To try to do what has been failing you all this time, because let's say it's more damage if you hit the punch and do the whole punch combo. But you could easily go, no, I'm just going to take the little bit of damage that this throw gives me and put you on the ground. Often very useful. The amount of times that people in this game get taken off guard by an attack that didn't quite work is quite high. So you shouldn't assume that because the frame data says someone should punish you, that they will, and similarly you shouldn't assume that because you quote-unquote should get punished, that you will be punished until you're at higher levels. It's up to you as a player whether or not it's your style to try to frustrate or stress out your opponent by pushing on this, or to play really solidly and try to make sure that you're never in those situations. Eventually, most of us become good enough to do both and it doesn't come up. But at the point we're talking about, your fundamentals might not be there yet, so it doesn't come up. We push forward once more. I think there is still a space in the lounge. You can join it if you are anywhere near the Atlantic Ocean. You should have a good enough connection to us, I think. We've been working on optimizing things like specific parts of connections, routers, and so on. You may see some differences. We don't know if everyone's is going to be the same as always, but if you've had good connection to us before, or are in mostly the eastern United States, all the way down to Florida and the Caribbean, you probably have good enough connection to everyone. Not perfect, but good enough. Once you've managed to learn, okay, I should throw in these situations, I should move around in these situations, I should look for opportunities to approach, especially in games with dashes, then you get a little better at chasing the people who do want to just defend, and you might be managing to float in silver or super silver. Because we're speaking only from the perspective of, do you have enough fundamentals to do this? Can you be there? Not necessarily consistently. Can you anti-air enough to stay there? Can you punish people enough with their weirder options to stay there? Do you understand enough of your character's frame data, either empirically, by just, hey, I've done this enough times to know it actually works, or by literally looking it up, to be able to say, yes, this should work, therefore I will keep doing it until it does work and figure out why I'm wrong, or ask someone, or any number of things of that nature. And then you have the ability to break through your opponent's highly defensive play with either throws or pressure followed by throws, simply because even if they run away from you, you're still going to manage probably to anti-air them. You're still going to manage probably to stay out of trouble when you're jumping yourself. And if they do any super long range moves, that you don't figure out some good way to evade, chances are these moves are, again, punishable. And if you've learned your punishes, at least some of the time, they'll do it in the wrong space, and you will get the punish done. This helps a lot with the calmness to stand in particular spaces on the screen, which is the beginning of a different style of fundamentals. Footsies. Which is our next bot in the sequence, Urian. It's a little bit more difficult for, or rather it was before the game started to mostly sell most of the characters together. But now that most people have access to Urian, and our Urian bot, while not easy to input, also doesn't rely as much on being perfect to get all of its functions working. You can probably have a fairly, let's call it shoddy Urian bot and still get what you need. You see this sort of thing happen because Urian, while he does have I'm crossing the screen now style moves, the thing you're dealing with when you're playing him is that situation you just saw. Both characters, both Urian, yes, the bot, and you, the player, are usually, unless your character has extremely long range, are usually trying to wiggle bound in a specific space so that you keep on hitting the other one's extended attacks, or so that you have watched for long enough, similar to the Ed situation, to know I have at least like one long range attack of my own, and you've just done something that makes it a good idea to use it. It is the beginning of what we like to call the whiff punish, and while Urian bot does have this in its point system, it isn't actually meant for you to learn to whiff punish. The specific requirement of the bot is actually stand in the place required to whiff punish. It does not matter if you can or cannot. It does not matter if your character can or cannot. Your skill at actually whiff punishing isn't relatively important to Urian bot. Your skill that is important is making sure you're standing there and not either freaking out, running away, or choosing bad options for your own attacks. It's a bot that allows for a lot of experimentation with your moves in neutral in footsies, while still requiring you to at least pay attention to other aspects of it. The air movements, the violence knee drop in his case, which basically is an air move that goes up straight and then comes back down on your head. It's pretty difficult to deal with. If he's input perfectly, he'll have the option for his EX moves and put you back in the space of dealing with something similar to Ken, where you have to punish a move that requires the quote-unquote crush, pound, or punish for maximum damage, but gives you a much smaller window to actually do it in. And then he has a powerful V-trigger that forces you to defend properly for a given amount of time, no matter where he starts it from, putting you in a lot of positions where you have to think through, as soon as you see it happen, wait, where exactly am I relative to this character? Because where I am relative to this character determines the most likely way that he will manage to leap and actually get to hurt me. In some cases you can just jump backward entirely out of Urian's V-trigger Aegis Reflector, and in some cases you have to do something entirely different. I don't agree with this stage at all. No, these are just incorrect. Why would you give Guile the javelin and Ryu the discus? Capcom, please. Anyway. Sakurabot is next in line, but is thrown in more so as a random refresher on everything. She does have one specific purpose, and that is to get you out of the mindset that every single rising move, every single long animation move is actually crush counter punishable. But this isn't a fundamental, this is more so an aspect of Street Fighter. And that's probably good because she wasn't actually an important or original bot. If you didn't buy this character, it really wasn't a big deal. You just had to learn this on your own somehow. She has moves that can't be punished in quite the standard way. That's just a thing that happens. But however, she is good at helping you continue the lessons taught by Urien. To the point where I would say that she's approximately equal. If you didn't have one character and you wanted to just do it with the other, for the most part, you'd learn at least that aspect of it. And from there, we move on to Nash, whose entire purpose is to let you take all those things you've learned, take all those fundamentals you have probably built up, and test them. Nash's purpose as a bot is entirely to let you test your own status. Watch yourself just automatically fight this. Watch what you do when you're not thinking very hard. Just literally turn off the part of your brain that is trying to do things, because if you are still in the state where you're trying to anti-air and you're trying to play footsies properly and you're trying to punish, you should go back. You have a different bot that you could still be working on. But once you're at the point of, okay, well I did all that, now what? Understanding the now what, particularly because now it starts to become pretty character dependent, you just load up a Nash bot, even a not particularly great Nash bot, and fight and watch yourself. If you find that you're not the sort of person who can focus on watching yourself during doing it, then probably you've got some sort of software that can help you record it. Particularly if you're on PlayStation, it's quite easy, and if you're on PC, there's usually something that isn't necessarily even for streaming or terribly overwhelming, just a way to do this sort of thing as a whole. Rewatching it will help you realize sometimes, oh, I do this too much, or I do that too much, or I don't understand certain specific small things, which do come up a lot because Nash's moves have weird hit and hurt boxes, so you'll find that the interactions don't always go exactly as you expect. You can see things like where are you underutilizing energy and where are you overdoing other things. And then once you are done with the pre-test, you can go up a notch and challenge yourself with BirdieBot, whose entire job is to let you know, yes, you are in fact good enough at these things, you are fast enough, you are understanding of this scenario, or you're not. And the fact that it's almost entirely speed and recognition is the thing that Nash can't show you. Nash isn't meant to test those things at a high level. In fact, Nash's purpose is to be slow enough for you to do all of the things, and for you to pinpoint any issues in how you choose to do them, or to learn specific interactions that are character dependent in order to take them into the BirdieBot training. BirdieBot is requirement. Do all these things. Recognize what's happening. Hit an opponent out of the air when they're doing a move on very short notice. Get into position, sometimes by dashing, to strike with a normal attack and then confirm into a special move and combo. In a situation that is not easy, it's not a punish per se, he's doing a thing that can put you in danger. And he's usually doing it from fairly far away, so if you do it wrong, you're going to die. On top of that, you still have to anti-air him, even though he doesn't jump all that often, and his other option forces you to think about your anti-airs both as a very fast one and a much more powerful or well set out one. And on top of all that, he basically punishes you in certain ways by getting his own points for standing there and letting him do certain things.
And that's basically why I've been practicing with Birdie Bot as of late. He does a really good job at like simulating all of the stresses that you would normally encounter while still having just enough offense layered in with his like various feed triggers to really spice things up and make you like double take on some of your habits at the same time.
Our Birdie Bot is also not terribly difficult to input. Compared to what other stuff, you'd think so because it's much more complicated to input correctly, but it's not actually physically difficult to do. It's a slight step up from other ones, and obviously it does require a bit more in terms of, is this completely correct? You'll notice very quickly if it isn't correct, but it wouldn't, I say, take you more than a few tries to get the bot input correctly, and thankfully it's extremely obvious when he isn't input correctly, because there's a bunch of stuff he doesn't do. You can of course check all of our very old disc guidance streams if you've ever wanted to check how exactly should this work, because they will show you almost always the most optimal outcome we could get for the bot. We don't generally show off the lesser ones, but we do show off the fact that, hey, this bot works even though the inputs aren't so perfect. There are many situations where we have a perfect input style bot, but it acts exactly the same as the imperfect one in almost every situation. And in that case, we'll normally show you on the stream the imperfect ones simply so that you can go, oh, if that's the problem, then it's not likely to make my bot not work. It's not an effect that will limit my capacity to grow using this. Once you've got all of that down, we'll generally assume not necessarily that you are in silver, because there are a lot of annoying people out there, and they play some very annoying ways, and lag is really a much larger... Lag has much more of an effect on whether or not you can stay in a certain rank if you are finding laggy opponents than one would ever like to be true in a game. But even with improved netcode for this game, the thing about people who learn to fight a specific way relative to lag is that they have explicitly learned how to make sure that you can't react to their stuff because of the lag, which means that anything they find you can react to, they'll just stop doing and they'll switch to the next thing in line. And there's a good chance out of the 5 or 6 things that you must be able to fundamentally do to stay at higher ranks in this game, one of them is going to probably get through your defenses if it's too laggy to deal with it. This is particularly true if you're not a particularly defensive player yourself and try to get out of situations by pressing buttons or trying to perfectly execute your uppercut or parry or any of those things. The lag is going to make you suffer even more in that case than normal. But this is still not necessarily so bad. You will still eventually be able to say, I know what I'm doing, and whenever you feel like you don't, you know where to go, at least if you are a bot user as a generality. Just go back to whatever bot does the best job of dealing with what you can't manage. And it's that point that, at least on our page, the easy bots end. But they're not necessarily harder from there in the sense of, is it harder to actually fight the bot or do the thing the bot requires? It's harder to learn what you need to learn, because it's possible if you were, unfortunately for you, the sort of person who looked at it in a specific way, like either this is helping you win or you've gotten it sorted down but you're still trying to do whatever you were doing before, that made you even bother to get the bot in the first place. You're just impatient to get back to doing what you were doing, and the bot is just a way to do that and say, okay, well, I practiced a bit. This is valid, but it won't necessarily be enough from the regimen of continuing with bots, because you have to understand why certain things were required, partially the reason for this entire stream, before moving on helps you in any way. You might just come to some completely incorrect conclusions and get stuck in a bad situation for a really long time as a result. So because of that, we move on to other bots, and we have those ones marked as a moderate difficulty. Sometimes it's a physical thing you're required to do, but it's not the physical thing that you're supposed to be learning per se. You're learning the understanding of why the physical thing is required. And that brings us straight to Ryu, who immediately switches from, okay, you can anti-air, to, alright, but can you anti-air all of these strange things? Can you punish a reversal style move when the move itself is ambiguous in some way? And of course, it helps you deal with people who have options to zone you and never have to jump or approach you, and technically don't have to ever uppercut to make themselves vulnerable enough for you to do big damage in the first place. Characters cannot often avoid footsies altogether, but if you are not good enough at forcing the situation or understanding the situation, they might be able to avoid footsies against you. And in this case, that's what Ryu's job is basically to teach. How do you anti-air? How do you create positive situations even when you haven't actually done damage to your opponent? You didn't get the knockdown, you didn't even land a hit, you just made them block. If you can make an opponent block, but it results in them being in a position you prefer them to be in, then that's straight up good for you. And Ryu is almost entirely based around knowing how to get punishes on things that are normally difficult to recognize, far less punish, as well as putting yourself in positions where by hitting certain attacks you get to keep on being in a good position. Our Ryu bot is a little bit confusing because while the bot itself can be input without too much difficulty, there is a secondary version, you could say, that we use for a kata, which is practicing something related but still slightly different. If you check our katas, you will find, I believe it is 22, which uses a modified Ryu bot. Yeah, there we are. And this is meant to actually explicitly help you to deal with punishes, maintain advantage. The page explains it in great detail, as to why you would want to do exactly this thing. But if you decided, no, I actually know how to do this stuff from other games, or I don't feel as if it's as important to my character or my style to do that as it is to make sure to actually hit people. Simply, let's say you have a character who doesn't have a problem with being zoned, or who can just do the same sorts of things and run out the clock until that's no longer relevant, then you can just move on. Just get a couple odd anti-airs down so that you're not taken by surprise by the people in, let's say, Ultra Silver to Low Gold, who have much better confusing options for jumping. They've gone past the linearity of, I have jumped and I have hit a heavy kick / heavy punch, straight to, I have jumped, but now you don't know exactly what's going to happen. And Ryubot can help you to learn a little bit about this. But if you want hit confirms, defensive confirms, making sure that you don't overcommit to strikes, then you can move on to our Boxer bot, which is entirely that. It is also relatively difficult to input in the technical sense. You have to understand a lot of things about bot theory in this game to correctly input this. And because he was at some point nerfed, the real core aspect of what made him effective at teaching you the matchup is gone. The matchup components are kind of faded out now, but he still has a good purpose as the hit confirms bot. The bot that teaches you, if you're trying to do all this footsies business and you strike at your opponent and they block, don't finish your combo. Or if they don't block, try to finish your combo. And this is very important, but also very difficult. There's not a lot of whiff punishing going on in here. And similarly, recognizing spacings that you needed to be at in order to get certain confirms done on defense. Basically, was I too far away when this person did this move to actually punish them strongly? Is another big deal. And that's what that bot generally will teach you, because he has a lot of moves where he's punishable, but only if he's spaced incorrectly. And you, in turn, must therefore space yourself so that he's incorrect as often as possible. Here we have a good example of what I'm talking about from a player who is, as you can see, quote-unquote still in Super Silver. Now again, remember that this is in no way meant to be a mark on the player as a whole. It's literally just the way the game works for the most part. If you don't have certain fundamentals, it's not that you cannot do anything, not that you can't win matches in Super Silver, it's that you can't get higher because everyone who went higher has them, and they tend to beat you up using them. Not every time. You could definitely win by just doing what you were planning on doing enough times and them happening to not get it right that day. But this whole I'm going to zone you and back off thing is really difficult to get too far into the game with. Even with the slight lag you're seeing, because you can blatantly see it here, because OmniRabbit is not expecting a certain set of things from this player at all, because they haven't demonstrated the specific fundamentals that he would be looking for. He just stands in specific spots. That's the entire matchup at this point. He's not aiming to push this person down, he's not aiming to stress them out. It's the idea that their fundamentals are not quite strong enough for them to not get stressed out on their own, and therefore will try to repeat things that aren't necessarily going to work. Now this isn't to say that those things don't work, and if you find yourself being beaten by this sort of thing, it's probably because you don't have specific fundamentals either, but we're talking like stuff that will take you all the way to Platinum, or at least to the point where you can keep up with Platinum players if you don't have a lot of time to play the game and actually build up like certain other damage-related skills. You have to spend a lot of time building up actual ability to deal damage and aim your attacks and get out of specific situations in order to not lose in gold. But we'll get to that later. The lounge is going to stay open for a while after the stream ends, and the stream itself is going to go on for a little longer. Fortunately, once I've basically explained the easy ones, like, there's no even a reason to discuss advanced bots in terms of fundamentals, because the entire reason we treat them as advanced bots is because they aren't fundamental. They are beyond that. But we are still going to have to go through a bunch of the moderate ones. I'm going to end up blitzing through them though, but it's still going to take longer than the standard amount of rest of stream. That said, this particular stream is meant for this purpose, and therefore it's allowed to run a little longer. If you happen to have Alex, he's not a fundamentals-based character in terms of the bot's purpose. The purpose of our Alex bot is to teach you some air reset and air hit stuff. It's to help you increase your damage against people who jump a lot or have special jumps, where you have anti-airs, but your better anti-airs don't lead to what you'd expect them to. And that's it. He just isn't at all based on fundamentals, which is useful because he also wasn't a character we always expected to be available to everyone, and it turned out to be useful that, and partially intended and like specifically chosen, that he's more so the air reset character. He, however, does do a very good job of this, so give it a touch if you have a character that benefits from having air resets and isn't just a zoner or something. Similarly, Dictator, or Bison as he is known in the US, is just another style of that character. You're learning to defend, some mix-ups, learning to watch your meter, which is sort of fundamental, but more so to this game than anything else. Lots of games have meters now, but the way you watch your meter changes from game to game. The only fundamental you are learning from DictatorBot is to watch your meter at all, and to base at least some of your decisions on it. That does, however, rotate us around to the next character that actually is meant to teach you some fundamentals, and unfortunately is quite difficult to input bot-wise. Our Fangbot's position in here is based on the idea that you should do the same things that you were doing for BoxerBot, to learn to confirm things, to learn to check your spacing on defense to determine whether or not your opponent was actually punishable or not, but without any blocking. Or rather, without blocking being the main thing that's making this decision for you. And it helps that this is against a character who will mostly not let you approach at all, so you're strongly incentivized to not just move up to Fang and hit him. You're incentivized to move to where Fang will strike into and miss. Fang is the one who gets to try to hit you, and your job is to stand in the right place such that when he does it, you can punish him, but not punish him by blocking and punishing him, because he very seldom does things where you actually get to do that very well. It's to stand so that that space directly in front of you is the one that Fang's strike will end up in, and make him vulnerable for you to hit back. It doesn't have to be, again, an actual whiff punish, that's not the purpose, because Fang's moves also take quite long to recover. You just need to be close enough that you could get a good punish in the time it takes for him to recover, but also not close enough to be hit, because if he does hit you with these moves, then technically you have been forced into block stun and you can't actually punish some of them anymore. So you want to make Fang whiff to miss entirely, and then as soon as you see that happen, because he doesn't have moves that linger all that well other than specials, just strike into the same space and do whatever will give you damage. In some characters' cases, they can literally dash after he's recovered from something and grab him instead, similar to how you would have done for Ed. And that will bring you to around the point where you could probably hang with the Ultra Silver people. And of course it's quite hard to actually learn, because you have to learn it per opposing character, but the core idea of, okay, which of your moves take long to recover but you actually want to use them, and how can I make you miss, is a fundamental skill in lots of games, whether or not it's an, as they call them, anime game where you're flying halfway around the screen and you're trying to make your opponent miss by changing sometimes your elevation, or in this game where you really only get to do it by either jumping straight up, jumping over in very few cases, or just walking right up and making them think it's time to hit this button and they're wrong. But now that you've gotten all that, you may notice that in order to get past that point in Ultra Silver, you need to learn to jump again. But you can't just jump. You have to make your opponent focus on all the other things that we've been discussing so far, and then jump anyway. Because the more you can make your opponent focus on, the harder it is to do it all. Learning to make your opponent think that you have a jump as an option, that they have to be ready to anti-air, allows you more freedom in your ground movement. It can distract people who have particularly good grounded buttons, footsie buttons as we often call them. They don't want to hit those buttons, because if they hit the buttons they'll be slightly more vulnerable, and if you chose to jump randomly a little bit before that and they went for the button anyway, then sometimes they get hit by the jump or couldn't even counter you to begin with. But for that you will need some help from Abigail. This is a bot where we at first were thinking that this was kind of counterintuitive, because he's not the best character to tell people to have access to go buy just to learn to jump. But it turned out that he was relatively popular and strong for a while, so it was likely a lot of people had the character. And he's still powerful enough and seen often enough, I think, that you probably care. He might not be the #1 choice for grappler players at the moment, but he's high enough on the list that you probably benefit from having additional Abigail bot experience. Mostly, this is about learning to time your jump and to punish some moves that are not themselves jumps. Abigail doesn't much jump at you. He does some giant flip stuff. He does jump sometimes, but his jump is very specific. It teaches you basically to anti-air just Abigail. But you are spending a lot of time thinking about, how do I jump? How do I get to my spacing to jump against this character with this extremely long range? And good anti-airs on top of it. All the while making sure that he doesn't hit you with a rolling kick that is actually only a low sometime during it, or hit you with any of his various charging attacks, or simply have those charging attacks interrupt your concept of flow in neutral and therefore, strictly speaking, mess up the same jump that you were doing. While the game does, specifically the bot does tell you to cross up against Abigail to do the special jump that causes you to land on and strike at his other side with the attack, and some characters can't even do this. Only a few, but there are some that can't. It will also just teach you a bunch of things about how jumps interact with characters like Abigail, who are good at keeping you out with range. And if your character has no cross-ups, you usually have to have another system for getting spacing. And the bot just tells you, well, you can either use it for Abigail matchup practice and use the rest of the point system, or come up with the equivalent, the thing that you need to do to distract an Abigail in neutral. Because he has so much more range than most characters. But some characters have enough range that they should be with punching him, for example. And that is equally valid. Some characters can even grab his arm when he tries to punch at them, or parry specific situations. The key is to make sure that what you're looking for is optimized spacing for something, while still dealing with a character who has very long range. The bot is not terribly difficult to input, it's a little bit timing restrictive, but I'd say it probably wouldn't take more than 10 minutes if you were trying and had any experience with other bots at all. It's also one of those bots where if it doesn't work terribly well, it's really obvious, so you can fix it quite quickly. And from there, it mostly just goes into a bunch of bursts of actions. Once you've learned to do all those things and added in, this is how you should jump to avoid someone like Abigail who has really good anti-airs that don't necessarily rely on special moves, you're pretty set. You wouldn't necessarily be in gold if you could do it all. Because again, lag and players that play some really strange styles. But the point isn't usually to actually be in gold. Once you've got all the fundamentals down, you can practice probably against at least most people up to diamond. Obviously there will be those who basically just ditch you because you're in some way wasting their time, which is usually people who have very pressury characters that you might not know all the defenses against. And to their credit, this is probably not worth their time that much. It's not important to layer their offense against someone who doesn't understand layer 1. But people who are looking to just have a general match will generally fight you even if they keep on winning, because at least they know you are planning or trying to do the thing that is required. And if you realize you keep on failing, basically indefinitely, all that tells you and them is that you probably either need to go check a matchup, which is what most of the rest of our bots are for, or one of your fundamentals needs more work. We do generally finish that level of fundamentals off with Akuma bot though, because Akuma is a character who will generally teach you not to do certain things, but it's very timing dependent. Most other characters up until this point, in terms of the bots alone, have more or less probably had you separate everything into good idea and bad idea. and it applies to more or less the whole matchup. It's not a good idea to do this move because this bad thing will happen, or my opponent has disadvantage, and it is a good idea to do this move to minimize that. But Akuma is a very free-form character, which means that most of the time, whether or not something is a good idea to do depends more so on both the Akuma player's mindset and their spacing at the time. So the bot is not quite random, but it has enough variation that you should be spending time thinking about whether or not moving around is required and whether or not you can react quickly enough while using almost all of your options instead of these ones are good ideas and these ones are not. This isn't true for every character because some characters have specific advantages over Akuma, but there are not that many of those. Most characters, even if you could theoretically defeat Akuma's moves, most of them are quick enough that until you're very good at the game, just the combination of the number of things Akuma can do taking up your perception, and the fact that he will sometimes just be able to change what he's doing midway, or you won't be sure which version of the move he did. For example, if he does his demon flip as it's known, the light version, the medium version, the heavy, and the EX all do very slightly different things. So he's good to use for learning that aspect of it, just to push yourself a little bit further and get past the idea of the binary style of play, the this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. Nash can also be used for this. In fact, Nash is probably where you got the first inklings of this, and Birdie, depending on your character, often throws in some feelings like that as well. But Akuma is entirely that. And even though you can't really say it teaches you the Akuma matchup for most characters, is still enough of information in there that you would probably come out of it having a better chance against any given Akuma player. At that point, then, you've learned how fast your reactions are, which ways your character works, and we start running down a really long list of bots whose purpose is to test you in a matchup and to teach you more of it. Zangief is a Zangief matchup bot, mostly. Even the reactions you are required to have are reactions that are pretty unique to Zangief. The same goes for Falk bot, and Blanca, even though we call it a Punish OS bot, that's a relatively advanced concept, and the real reason that you would need a Punish OS is again, Blanca matchup, ambiguous moves happening. Once you've gotten all the way up to gold and feel as if you could stay there or are keep on dipping in and out of it, then you can outright upgrade your Nakali bot to Nakali bot 2.0, with the purpose primarily being you learned how to anti-air, you learn how to space yourself defensively. You go back to that point with a bot that is trickier, just to make you understand that okay, yes, that was good, but now that you're in gold and people have perfected the jump, a thing that we literally call the golden jump for this reason, you may have to do a little better than just recognizing that they jumped. A lot of other things are going on, and as a result of it, we have provided another bot that will specifically jump at you, whereas a few of the others were meant to jump at you while teaching you something else. Nakali bot 2 is going to jump at you explicitly. And again, in the end, it's technically a Nakali matchup bot, because you wouldn't have learned much of anything about the Nakali matchup from the original, so you just upgraded to get that. Down the line, we do more and more of the same thing. Luke bot, which has been thrown in recently, is basically unnecessary, could be skipped simply because he was put in so late that we just put him in his correct space in the order. Luke's attack spacings determine whether or not you can punish him properly, and you have to recognize that, and that's still functionally a Luke matchup situation. Similarly, Guilebot 1.0 teaches you to bulldog in, but this only really matters if you have a character that must walk into Guile's attacks or figure out a way to negate or mess with sonic booms. And then you can just get more hit confirms, because if you can't hit confirm on Guile, you're probably going to lose. But this is again, Guile matchup specific. Lara bot is about teaching you meaties, which are Very useful to have, but clearly not fundamentals. They are literally a calculation of, am I advantaged after this knockdown or not? And Dalsim is about air-to-air awareness, but Dalsim is one of the only like 3 characters where you even care. Megabot's purpose is often to help you become braver, because if you don't, she's going to basically knock you around a lot. But it's still a matchup concept bot. You're still fixing a problem that is mostly specific to Mika. Gil is probably the only bot in this section that actually teaches you something that you could call fundamentals, but it's just an extension of Urien, just as, strictly speaking, Nakali was an extension of Nakali. And similarly, Honda bot moves on to be the second form of something prior as well. It's very similar to Boxer bot, just learning some defensive confirms, learning I can't punish this character from here, so I need to move somewhere else altogether. And it's still mostly matchup. Oro is the same, and Claw is absolutely the same, despite mentioning that it's for like learning to react to multiple situations. You could learn to react to multiple situations against any character that presented multiple situations. Claw just happens to present more of them than a lot of other characters, and therefore you need it more for him. Our Dalsim bot 2.0 is mostly about learning air-to-airs, but again, you can't call air-to-airs fundamental. There are other bots before that that would have required you or encouraged you to use air-to-airs. And learning some advanced air-to-airs would probably help, but it's probably not the thing keeping you out of platinum, let's say. Or causing you to drop out of gold when you don't want to. Kagebot is helpful in that it teaches you awareness during your own offense, but that's really just a misnomer. It's just telling you that some people are going to uppercut no matter what you do, and you will never scare them enough to get them to stop. They will uppercut, they will super, they will use moves that technically feel like they make no sense because they know, and again this is mostly a thing that comes from Kage and characters like him, they know that if they succeed, even a little bit, half your life is going to be gone. So they're much more incentivized to take those risks than other players who won't get massive damage off doing it. And that's just your way of learning, oh, against this style of character, I need to be a little more aware on offense. But this style of character is mostly embodied by Kage, so it's, strictly speaking, still matchup. Sagat is a question of long-range jumps and approaches, but again, Sagat is the character you need these against. And Dan was put in mostly to teach people the new V-shift mechanic that came along with him. The V-shift itself allows you to get specific special whiff punishes, forced whiff punishes, and confirms off those. So Dan came along with it, so we decided, okay, well, if you're going to train it with Dan. But it can't be a fundamental because it doesn't even exist in most other games. V-shift is very specific to Street Fighter, I think. And yet, so on it goes down the list. Poison, long range with punishes because Poison is a long range character and that is the matchup. Rose is a lot of weird things put together and the ability to play all sorts of ways, and that is why she is the bot you'd face at the end of this. Did I learn all the other things? Because I've now faced a character, or I'm now facing a character, that can do all of them. Everything beyond that is more or less just something specific to Street Fighter V, throws, or a matchup thing. Understanding conditions, different characters having little bits that they can do that you can't see otherwise, special mix-ups that you would not expect from any other character, learning to switch your mindset very fast, or becoming more confident in special anti-airs. All of these things are things you could build up without the more advanced bot, just by practicing more or understanding more. But you could also just, if you have the time to use the bot, get a little bit of a jolt or head start because they are actually providing more of a challenge to begin with, and therefore you can probably make a little faster progress by using them. I think we're going to actually close out this without you getting to watch this match, because we have more or less come to the end of the stream. So I'll leave you hanging in between after their match 1, simply because we have basically run this particular stream for as long as I'm willing to run it. An hour and 15 minutes is now about the new limit for our content, as the 90-minute stuff was probably pushing it.
Bow down before my psycho power. Round 1.
We think that this week we're more likely to have the Wednesday night in birth content than the Tuesday melt. But there's also the possibility, depending on certain flows, that we may have both of them. You can, however, as usual, count on our Feeling Thursday Battle Lounge for King of Fighters 15. And we are aiming to work on a King of Fighters bot this week. But which exactly of the 2 bots I have in mind turns out to be the one that actually gets finished in terms of production is going to depend a lot on a specific person's available time, as they are the one who specializes in the character required, and it's a fairly difficult character. In the other case, it's the same thing. The character isn't necessarily that difficult, but knowing all of the specifics requires a player that can see why the thing that's happening in the bot happens the way it does, and it does depend on their time. But I expect that at least one of the 2 players is going to be available, so you will get some bot on Friday for disc guidance. If you're a King of Fighters fan, remember that you only get to keep 1 bot at a time. But we figured, while we have one very simplistic one, people who don't need that might prefer to go straight to a very complicated one. And therefore we're going to develop one for each. Let's call it style of play. One for basically dealing with a point character, and one for dealing with an anchor character. I'm hoping that we do the point character one first, but again, availability. So if you're watching this on YouTube months from now, you can look within this same week of content for whichever bot did in fact get released in this guidance. We should possibly have our Saturday content, but we didn't have it this time, so it's hard to say. On Sunday, we will be having Do Not Falter, our DNF dual lounges, and that will bring us back to another Monday for Street Fighter V. But with that, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training, and good night, everyone.